we're in a wonderful time in the cattle market. Do I have fears? Yes, I have fears.
It's our annual market and weather outlook show for this coming year. We're going to start first with the cattle markets as Clint Berry joins us as our guest to discuss the factors playing into our markets for these next couple of years, as well as the Cattle Facts market forecast prices for this year from fat cattle down to ball and calves. Plus, we'll also be discussing on just how long will this market stay up, price protecting, and beef demand.
It's the celebratory protein. I mean, you don't celebrate graduations with chicken breast.
Then meteorologist Don will join us to discuss the weather outlook for the year.
But what I don't see for the summer is a dirt burner.
And we'll wrap up our discussion on 20 and 30-year weather patterns. A lot to cover on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Welcome you here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for joining us on our program today. We do have a lot to cover, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But I did want to pass along a note here that I got from Dr. Kenny Burdine. Now, he's out of the University of Kentucky, but he joined us back in episode 200 as we were talking about the 4 cattle market questions that need to be answered in 2025. But he, along with his counterparts, Josh Maples out of Mississippi State and James Mitchell out of the University of Arkansas, all these guys collaborating together to put out Cattle Market Notes Weekly. And you can subscribe to that, a very extensive look each and every week at the cattle markets. And I will put the subscription site to that in our show notes here today if you want to check that out. Well, as we turn towards our program, we're going to start first with the cattle markets. And joining us, as he does each and every year to do this, is a good friend of mine, Mr. Clint Berry. He's out of St. Angelo, Texas. He's been a Superior rep for many, many years. And Clint, good to have you here again on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate the chance to get to visit again.
Well, when you picked up the phone, I said you need to get out of the lounge, because I thought you were still on vacation, but you said you're back at it now, huh?
Yeah. No rest for the wicked. You got to keep pressing the miles. So,
yeah. Okay. Well, to have you on our show here today really was to go through some of the information that we got from the cattle convention recently from Cattle Facts, and just to kind of you and I to bounce back and forth on some of that information. And I think to start here today, before we start getting and jumping into what the outlook numbers were that they talked about at Cattle Facts at their presentation, was really to kind of set a baseline, or at least fundamentally where we're at in our market here today. I think first and foremost, let's start with the feed side of things, because then we can start to build around that. In the report that we heard from Cattle Facts, really kind of some good news there, and that we're not seeing any dramatic jumps in prices in feed. We kind of saw that a little bit last year. In fact, I'd say that we maybe saw even feed prices go down a bit last year.
Yeah, I'd agree with you too. You know, a little more abundance of moisture in most of the country. I know some folks are going to disagree when I say that, but for the most part, we were blessed with moisture in a larger area of the country, and hopefully our long-term forecast is looking that way too. But some guys were able to rebuild some of those hay stocks, and I know in the Southern Plains, this isn't the best year we've ever had for wheat, but it's certainly one of the better ones. So we've been able to cut some costs there and run some cows on forage, and I know I've got a lot of friends that live in the fescue belt, and they were able to get a lot of fescue stockpiled, which is a foreign idea to what most ranchers have heard. But, that's growing grass in the fall of the year when they can, and turning cows out and actually grazing it instead of baling and feeding it. So there's been a lot of decrease in that overall cost of production. I think that's a good thing. Inflation and fuel prices and stuff, who exactly knows where that's going to trickle. But overall, looked pretty good, and Cattle Facts numbers prove that.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing, what I'm getting out of it, is just not any dramatic jumps. Now, again, I mean, there's good, from a weather side of things, we could see some pressure on some things, but not really anticipating anything major. And that is way different than what we saw even 3 years ago with some of these, mainly in hay prices.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, keeping that in perspective is the important part. There'll be some areas that have some issues, but overall, a lot better shape than what we've been in prior years.
So, Clint, I know you feed some cattle out, so let's just kind of maybe expand a little bit further on the feed side of things. And the next guy in line, of course, on our show here, a lot of times we're talking with a lot of cow-calf type operations. I know we do have some farmer feeders and feedlots that do listen to the program, but for the most part, from a feedlot's perspective, what are they seeing?
Yeah, costs are down from last year. Now, I say all that. You asked the question, and so I'm answering it.
Okay.
Feed costs are down from last year. Interest rates are not down from last year.
Yeah.
And my interest is probably playing as big an effect on feed prices as about anything. But the most I've paid really in my adult lifetime here the last 18 months, 2 years, and that's a factor that plays into it, both on procurement costs, but also on feed costs. But yeah, my feed costs are down probably on a personal basis, I'd say a strong 20%. Of course, calf prices are up 50%. So it's an offsetting expense, but overall feed prices are good. And, corn's trickling up right now. Here we are talking in February, and corn's trickling up and cracked $5 mark today on the board. And, exactly where that's going to go before we have some correction there, I'm not exactly sure, but, a little higher than what it was earlier in the fall, but overall that's not undoable prices.
Mm-hmm. As you talked about interest rates, and in the presentation that Cattle Facts did, I think it was Kevin Good that was talking on the supply and demand portion of that. He did address interest rates, and really not seeing necessarily a huge decline in that, kind of staying flat. We might see a quarter point or so here and there, but not anticipating a big drop in that in regard to what we've already seen.
Yeah, I would agree, and I can't imagine that would really surprise anybody. The American economy is not in terrible shape by any means, but we've been a lot stronger. We've been fighting inflation, and one thing about it, I don't think you're going to see dramatic cuts in interest rates until we start to curb that and kind of turn that corner and launch this economy off again. I think that we're going to live in the interest rate world that we're in probably within a half a point for the next year or maybe 2 years. Who knows? I think part of the interest rates are probably part of what's holding some folks back on expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know if that's the right answer. I mean, if cattle increase 30 to 50% in value, I don't know that the interest rates doubling is really as big a factor, but everybody's got to do what's right for their own business.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a good segue into what I want to talk about next, Clinton. We'll do that after the break, and that is specifically looking at those heifer retention numbers. The USDA has released that latest report the end of January. We're going to talk about that as we continue to look at the fundamentals in this 2025 cattle outlook. This segment today brought to you by Safety Zone Calf Catchers. And now here's the captain, Tim O'Byrne, with more.
Hey everybody, Tim here. We're fixing to come up on 1 million downloads of our Working Ranch radio show podcast, which is really exciting. And it got me to thinking about another viral moment that we had back in 2017 when we ran a short Facebook video of the Safety Zone Calf Catchers. And it was so popular, it got 6.8 million views in the first 5 days. I want you folks to check it out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers. It's a great product for all producers. Keep you safe when you're working with baby calves, especially for old timers like me who maybe can't outrun those cows anymore. Check them out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone Calf Catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone Calf Catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
Clint, I want to jump into now just looking at the numbers that we physically have on the ground right now. I think that's sort of, is when we look at this and starting to look at projections, it's going to be really about, okay, where are we at now? And we've definitely seen for several years now in a row that our heifer retention rates have continued to go down. I think they felt like we were going to see a little bit more, maybe more stabilization or leveling off in that a bit, and maybe not the steep decline, but according to USDA numbers, when they released in the end of January that kind of detailed where we're at the end of the year, we're still seeing these heifer retention numbers down a bit.
Yeah, that's right. I don't sense that there's a lot of appetite for true expansion. I know there's some folks that are trying to rebuild after, facing drought conditions and or some of the historic fires that really devastated certain regions, but I don't think there's any appetite nationally. And if you look at the number of cattle that are calving and the number of heifers, percentage of heifers that are on feed, I mean, those kind of numbers just reinforce that. And you can see it in the marketplace. I mean, just basic elementary figures, when heifers are $20 to $30 spread in behind steer prices, there's no pressure for replacements.
Yeah.
It's really easy when you see those solid statistic numbers that just stick out, that there's just no pressure for heifer retention. I have to believe we're gonna see some of that as we move into the fall. There's just been too many years of cuts here. And honestly, I'm going to look at it from an optimistic standpoint. There's been a lot of ranchers that have been able to put some cash into their pocket over the last few years with higher calf prices and higher cull cow prices. And I think doing some reinvestment into infrastructure there is going to pay back. I'm afraid it's going to happen rather quickly, and probably about the time green grass starts to show up, you'll start to see pressure. And then I would anticipate, at least in my customer base, as we move into the summer sales, we're going to start seeing a few more heifer loads getting contracted to stay at home instead of being sold and shipped out. But, some of that's going to play into just the overall appetite for the economy. And we forget that sometimes.
Yeah. Here was something, and I have heard this, we're at a high point in this market. How many producers that are at that point in their life thinking, now's a good time to get out? What are you, what's your thoughts?
I've had, on a personal level, I've had, in the last 18 months, probably, I can think off the top of my head, 4 or 5 guys that have done that. They didn't really have a good succession plan for somebody to come back. Maybe their kids or grandkids weren't as interested in ranching and putting in the time that it takes to do that. And then the other side of it is, like you said, we've seen historic all-time high numbers, and, business 101, sell when things are high. And a lot of them did that and cashed out. And I don't anticipate those folks coming back. No. I anticipate some younger folks maybe having an opportunity to lease some ground or expand what they're working with. But, you're going to have that generational turnover. But I'm going to be 50 years old this year, and I've never seen any prices like this. So, most people, nobody alive has seen any prices like this, just to be fair.
Yeah. Well, and I think guys are just looking at it and saying, okay, am I willing to go another 15?
Right. And I think a lot of that pressure has to do with outside cow number issues. It has a lot to do with factors on equipment costs and land values and operating loans. And just things that are bigger than just the cow prices. It just, kind of a perfect storm. Here we are calving the smallest cow herd in 7 decades, and highest number of heifers on feed. And let's be fair, there's another portion of that we've got to remember. We're experiencing the greatest demand for our product that we've ever had, in any generation. And that's a big contributing factor that we have to remember. It's one thing to be short on supply, but hey, we're long on demand. And if those two were flopped, this would be a terrible market. But that's one thing we're enjoying too. And I don't see that changing domestically and internationally.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that was brought up, that demand is still very strong, and there's even some room, as crazy as it sounds, there's even some room in that pricing to go even a bit higher. And that just seems crazy to me, but that's what they're saying. Okay, now, one more thing when we talk about just, what is supplying our beef. As we know, we're at one of our lowest herd sizes that we've had in, 1950, something like that. And so one other element that's a part of this beef supply now is our dairy cross. And we're now seeing about 1 million more dairy cross in the beef supply than we were 10 years ago. However, the dairy herd is shrinking a bit.
Right. Now, big picture, the one thing in our industry, you hear the word sustainability thrown around a lot. Let's talk about sustainability.
Okay.
Sustainability is a little bit of being able to keep the farmers and ranchers in business, but it's also producing at a level that's required due to the demand. And that, I thought, one of the most encouraging things is to be calving a herd as small as we are and harvesting the number of head that we are producing more beef than we ever have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that speaks to great efficiencies in all segments, whether that's genetics, overall health, being able to get more cattle from birth to harvest, efficiencies in processing, packaging, distribution, all of those things that play in, not one single area, but all those things that played in. And beef on dairy is a good point. Mm-hmm. We're not breeding more dairy cows. We're not actually physically breeding more dairy cows. but we are making a steer product out of those dairy cows that is much more efficient, that is harvested at an earlier age and is more efficient at putting pounds on using less resources. And that is a big boost to the overall beef production. And that number is encouraging from that standpoint. Could that be a challenge when our numbers are flipped? Sure. But make no mistake, we're not magically breeding 5 million more dairy cows.
Yes.
We're not growing that herd. We're just simply making more efficient animals out of the cows that we are breeding. And I think that's a big testament to the long-term sustainability, if you want to use the word, of beef production. And I realize we're talking dairy, but at the end of the day, that's what they're making. So I find that encouraging and pretty astounding. Talk about having a story to tell the consumer about doing more with less. I mean, that to me is a big boost in the feather, and especially in the dairy industry, which doesn't enjoy the same consumer optimism that we get in the ranching world, because their cows are in confinement, and that sometimes that's negatively seen. But I think that's a big bonus to what the dairy side of beef production has done.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings me down to the net, and you're doing a great job of giving me lead questions here, ideas, because you're saying things that's taken me to the next question here. And you were talking about doing more with less, and I will not argue, and I don't think anybody in the beef industry will argue with that. However, there is a caveat a little bit to that, and that is these hanging weights of carcasses have also increased quite dramatically. In fact, in 2000, the average carcass weight was 739 pounds. In 2024, the average carcass weight was 848 pounds. That's a 109-pound increase in 24 years. So but that also kind of coincides with, supply and demand too, isn't it?
Right. Especially as we've entered into let's say the last 24 months, as we've entered into shorter numbers, one of the tactics or strategies that the packers use is to allow for heavier carcasses.
Yep.
I just on a personal experience, I can't speak completely across the entire industry, but here's a good example. Used to, you'd get discounted for 1,050-pound carcasses.
Yeah.
Anything over that, and that got bumped up to 1,100 pounds now. So now it's not standard to make 1,100-pound carcasses all the time, but you get what I'm saying.
Yep.
There's an incentive there to make those cattle bigger.
Yeah, no, and that's an interesting, and that does it just coincides. It always has, as you said. It always has.
Always has.
Don't get too caught up in that, but it is an interesting thing to note. Okay, that brings me up to the next question. That is slaughter capacity, because boy, has that dramatically changed. Of course, we have less cattle out there, so shackle space is higher with less cattle to kill. But in addition to that, we're also seeing some new plants coming online as well.
Right. And that's encouraging. And remember long term how long that it is to turn that battleship around. Here we were a few years ago when COVID was going on, and we had plants going idle because of workforces and couldn't get enough cattle processed. And that was a big push, an extra push for extra shackle space. And lo and behold, we've got new plants in the process at start or completion, or that are coming online here over the next 2 years. I can think of two and one in Nebraska, one in Iowa, one in Texas that are coming online. American Foods Group's opening one near St. Louis, which is a cow kill plant, but also has the ability to kill some fat cattle. We're going to add quite a bit of shackle space there in the overall picture, and diversify some of those buyers on the packing side. And I think that's all wonderful for producers. That's just leverage on our side of it. Play the devil's advocate a little bit. If we hold the supply numbers at a low and we increase shackle space and kill capacity just from efficiencies, are we going to idle some of the older plants? Because, we forget, but there's some older plants out there that are older than I am that have been renovated twice in my lifetime. And there's a reason that they don't buy an old plant and renovate it. It's cheaper and more efficient to build a new plant because the technology has advanced so much, as a way to look at it. And so could we lose some existing older shackle space? I wouldn't be surprised at that in my lifetime. Yeah. But I still say it's definitely a very optimistic outlook to have the ability to be killing cattle in more areas and more regions. Yeah, that's a good point that you said right there. More area and more regions, to seeing that just rather not so quite heavily
as it's been, for years. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, Clint. That's a really good point there. Okay, let's take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to jump into outlook. Price outlook that Cattle Facts talked about, and then I just want to also kind of reflect maybe a little bit on some of the new administration talk with tariffs and those kinds of things that you're hearing, and maybe some thoughts on that. So we'll get to those when we come back. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and had excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
Support your cattle's health and productivity with Vigortone minerals. Since 1912, Vigortone has been a trusted name in animal nutrition. Our revitalized product line offers targeted nutrition for every stage of production and every region. Vigortone delivers consistent performance and simplifies your mineral decisions. Wherever you are, Vigortone works. Visit Vigortone.com to learn more.
All right, Clint, let's jump now into the outlook that that Cattle Facts projected for 2025 on this market. As we were talking there at the break, both you and I were at Cattle Convention in San Antonio, and they gave this presentation. We'll just kind of start with these heavy fat cattle and work down from there and what they are projecting for this coming year. They put that at about $1.98, which is 12 cents higher than a year ago. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing that right now. And in certain cases, especially like some of the trade in the north, we're above it.
Yeah.
There was a lot of days here at the first part of this year where the February contract was as high or higher than the April. You don't see that very often on the live cattle contracts. And I just think that's an overall picture of the strength that we have there. Now, I'm going to tell you, with expenses and the price of feeder cattle, we better be selling $2 fat cattle. If guys are expecting, selling $1,600 to $2,200 calves, depending on what size they are and when you're shipping them. I mean, the feeders is going to need at least $2 to make that kind of work to hold that together. So I think that's a new baseline where we kind of got to be looking. And who would have thought that? I mean, I alone have sold less than $1 calves, so I understand that.
Yeah. Okay, let's move down to feeder cattle. Approximately 800-pound feeder cattle. They pegged it this year at around $2.70 a pound. That's 22 cents higher than a year ago. That's yearlings headed to grass, basically.
Yeah. And that's all of those numbers we've seen on the video at Superior. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me a bit that those are projections, and usually they're a little conservative.
Yeah.
But usually they're pretty much their trend lines on target. So I won't deny that in the least bit, that I think that's probably a good round number. And what does that mean? Well, that means we're going to probably trade 8 weights from 255 to 290.
That's exactly what they said. Clint, that's exactly what they said. That was going to be, which is a pretty big range. I always, I never really like listening to market reports where they gave you a range of 40 cents. You're
right. It's like, that means they didn't have enough to test it. That's what that means.
But that's what they're saying.
Yeah, and our numbers at Superior back that up. So, each year, Merck Animal Health and Kansas State University evaluate our pricing points is to kind of spit out to Superior and our customers of where those cattle are trading. And, last year they averaged on calf prices, wean steer prices, a real and mean average was 572 pounds on a calf. Those cattle ended up selling in 2024 at an average of over 293.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was 11% up from 2023.
Yeah.
And 2023 was 48% up from 2022. So you want to talk optimism?
Yeah.
According to our numbers at Superior, we're selling cattle over the last 2 years for 50% more than we did 2 years ago. That now, can you expect to get higher than that? Yeah. I mean, I guess you could, but we're in a wonderful time in the cattle market. Sometimes we got to stop and realize how blessed we are at times. You know, you want to be as competitive as you can, but I mean, all those numbers are trending that way and showing those results.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into this calf market, because what they're predicting there, and this would be about for a 550 weight steer calf, to be projecting at around $3.40 a pound. Now, that's 29 cents higher than last year. And that, again, seeing a pretty significant jump. Is that conservative or right on track?
Well, you know, and I guess what I mean, yes, I think the numbers are realistic, especially because we're already selling cattle on the video for more than that.
Mm-hmm.
So now that's, I don't know that I could say we're going to sell every calf for that, but you know, I mean, it's obvious our numbers from 2024 is going to back that up, and early projections of what we're seeing right now are going to reinforce that. Do I have fears? Yes, I have fears. I have two fears.
Okay.
Number one fear is the American consumer. They still eat 85% of all of our product. And I realistically, according to the numbers, I guess it's there. And COVID taught me that people are willing to pay more for beef than they ever have. And 2024 taught me that too. But at some point, I can't help but have some fears as to pricing out, and not pricing completely out of the market, but, you know, maybe cutting back on 1 or 2 meals a week on beef over other competitive proteins, because we're 3 and 4 times higher per ounce. How much more can the consumer handle in lieu or in rational thinking of how quick is the overall economy turning?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, they consistently go to beef because it's the best protein out there, and it's the celebratory protein. I mean, you don't celebrate graduations with chicken breasts. So, I mean, it's one of them things that I you know, it's a staple of the American diet. But that's one fear. The other fear would be what we talked about a while ago. We got to make sure we're getting what we can on them fat cattle to make profit in all segments, because you can't pay $3 5 weights and not be cashing out and expect them to continue to dump into those cattle, especially because a lot of 550 weights, like that number that Cattle Facts is spitting out, those are balling calves.
Yeah.
And balling calves love to die, especially in the fall.
Yeah.
I mean, now you've got a $3 550 weight. You've got a $1,700 animal that's average vaccinated and entering into the most stressful period of its life. I think it's a big reinforcement to farmers and ranchers. Remember to do that little extra to hold your buyers together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I mean, it's a great time. You've got some extra money in your pocket. This is not the time to do less. This is the time to do more to make sure that your buyer can be profitable too.
Yeah. On this calf market, real quick, because there's some other things I want to make sure we have time to cover. But real quick, from a year cycle standpoint, predicting the highs to be in April, the lows to be in mid-October, and back up in December. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's
pretty normal.
But yeah, let's look at 30 years. That would almost fall, into that 100% of the time. So yeah.
The only thing, the only thing about that, Clint, I think about is when this market plateaus a bit and maybe he's on the different direction, or that year that happens, which they're saying is around 2027 when we see the plateau. Not necessarily saying it's going down, but it plateaus a bit.
Sure.
That cycle could change a bit, couldn't it?
Oh yeah, it did in 2014, did in 2013, and it sure reinforced itself in 2015. Well, that's the ups and downs. So, you know, but mathematically thinking, if we start retaining heifers this year, they get bred in the spring of 26, they calve in spring of 27, first calf comes to the weaning pen in the fall of 27, and now we're just back to equal to where the heifer was that we pulled out from this year.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a long time to turn that crank on the beef industry. And I mean, that's why I say, I think long-term we have a very optimistic future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So as we kind of wind down here, I want to address a couple things, because we just talked a little bit about what they're predicting is things to sort of level out in 2027. Randy Block, when he gave the final part of that presentation with Cattle Facts, one of the things that he talked about was some volatility in this market. Your thoughts on volatility and some protection on that?
Yeah, that one really drove home to me.
Yeah.
Because I probably had as many conversations in the last 6 or 8 months with folks about some risk protection, and whatever format that looks like to you. But here's the simplest answer that I have.
Okay.
Let's assume there is no more volatility today than there was 6 months ago, than there was 18 months ago, or that there'll be any more volatility in the next 12 months. Let's just assume that volatility percentile is the same.
Okay.
There's no more risk than there was before. Spitting out some of those numbers, we've increased cattle prices from 40 to 50%, and that's a conservative number. But 40 to 50% on a per head basis is the value. So even if we just live with the volatility we've had, which has been pretty horrendous over the last few years, since COVID, it's been really horrendous. But let's just assume we stay at that level. Now our numbers have more zeros behind them. Well, that alone is more volatility. I mean, I don't know. This is the kind of market that if we drop that same 40 to 50 percentile in a short period of time to an outside fundamental reason, like lockout on exports or some kind of drastic disease outbreak that shuts us down, that's the kind of numbers that break ranches.
Yeah.
If you're not protected. So, I mean, I think it's very, very wise to take some of these profits and at least protect yourself from a failure. Not necessarily saying you got to cap your top, but, work with those advisors that you trust, whether that's some LRPs, whether that's putting call options, whatever that is that you feel like you need to do and you're comfortable with. I mean, there's just no reason to leave yourself this exposed when you're dealing with those kind of zeros at the end of the check.
That's a good way to put it, for sure. Okay, one more thing I want to hit before you head out here today, and that is, as we have the new administration, of course, the first thing that and you've been talking about it before he even took the oath of office for the second time, was tariffs. What are you hearing on tariffs?
A lot of fear. And it's understandable. I can understand why people would be afraid. And I understand that, here we were talking inflation and the cost of goods gone up, and that could affect certain goods for the American consumer. It also is it's probably a bigger fear for our North American trading partners in Mexico and Canada. And you're hearing more out of them than anywhere. The full-blooded American in me says, we're not asking too much to prevent the tariffs. We're asking for some increased security on the border. You saw Mexico step right up immediately and do that. Also, we've got some tariffs on goods that are coming and going. And, I think about Canada and some rough numbers there. Roughly 80% of their goods are exported.
Yeah.
They're in a lot worse shape about what a tariff could look like than we are. Now, that's us being selfish as Americans, right? And I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm just saying I don't think long term it will be the same issue, as big an issue as what the amount of fear that's out there, because I believe that we all want the same thing. Long term, we all want the same thing. Could there be some short term disruptions? Absolutely. Would I expect those tariffs to be on beef coming and going? Yes, I do, because that's going to be a key part of the trade negotiations that go on, and that could affect us. But I don't think it's going to devastate the market by any means.
Yeah. Like you said, it's Mexico, Canada, two trade partners that we've had. I think more so the Canadians, because it's something that, especially in my neck of the woods, and even further north, I mean, you kind of have some movement across that border with similar type cattle.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's be fair, that a lot of our cattle are being fed there. They buy them here, take them up there and finish them, bring them back to us and harvest them here. So that is a legitimate fear, and I understand that totally. But I gotta say, I just gotta believe that cooler heads will prevail and it won't be nearly as dramatic. I'm not saying that there wouldn't be initiation of some of those, but I'm just betting that, because none of us want that long term, either side. And I don't think either side's asking for that much difference in what the negotiation is. So I just gotta believe that we're probably got more fear than what's really going to come to fruition. At least that's what I'm hoping. Maybe that's the glass that's half full in me kind of attitude I have.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, and I appreciate your perspective just as a whole today. It's a lot of positive elements in the market. Definitely not, don't look so starry-eyed that everything's going to be glitter and roses, but it's good, isn't it?
Right. That's right. Well, in the cattle business, there's never another bad day. So, you could always get that going for you, unless you've been in it long enough.
Yeah. All right. Well, Clint, thanks for being here on the program today.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Justin.
You bet. Clint Berry joining us here on the program today. He's based out of San Angelo, Texas. I appreciate his take. He's been a marketing rep for Superior Livestock for many, many years. Just one of the things that he does, amongst other things. But I hope you've enjoyed our conversation here today as we digest kind of some of the information coming out of the Cattle Facts report and numbers that we heard recently at the Cattle Convention. It's kind of become an annual event where he and I have that discussion. And I always like to bring him back, sometime in about June or so, too, to talk about how this calf market is taking shape and what that's going to look like as we hit those summer video sales and into that fall run as well. So we hope to have him back for that. Now, stay with us. We're going to continue on as we talk about 2025 outlook. The next thing that always plays into all of this is weather. Meteorologist Don Day will be stepping in next, and we're going to take a look at what he anticipates for the 2025 weather outlook. This segment today brought to you by the North American Limousine Foundation.
With rising feed costs and an increased focus on sustainability within the beef industry, feed efficiency is more than a buzzword. It's rapidly becoming a battle cry in an industry challenged to do more with less. By incorporating today's Limousine and Limflex genetics into your planned crossbreeding program, you can capitalize on the breed's inherent feed efficiency advantage and moderate cow size, while still banking the premiums paid for high-quality, high-yielding carcasses. That's two ways to profit instead of one. Let Limousine and Limflex deliver dollars to your bottom line. Limousine today, profit tomorrow.
And as we turn now and look at our weather outlook, joining us is meteorologist Don Day. And from a weather outlook, you always kept us up to speed on this, but we do know that La Nina came in December. We're kind of in that phase right now. Is that pretty weak, or where are we at with that?
We're in its weakening phase right now.
Mm-hmm.
It is still we're still technically in a La Nina, but it's fading. And I think the important thing to remember about when we talk El Niños and La Ninas, they're not static. They go through a life cycle and a process, and you tend to get different weather based on their life cycle. And right now, the life cycle of this current La Nina is to be in the weakening phase, which is much different than its strengthening phase. And we're starting, we've seen that here over the last couple of months and what can happen when that begins that process.
So as you look ahead and as you began to formulate what the rest of this year is going to look at, what are some of the fundamentals from a weather perspective that you're watching?
Two things. One is what we just talked about, which is that when La Nina goes into its stage of dying, going through its death throes, so to speak, out in the tropical Pacific, when it's timed to be right at the same time we're changing seasons, which is the end of winter now, and we'll be talking spring, at least officially spring here in not too long, is that you want to go back and look historically when that's happened before. And when we've seen that before, it does tend to lead to a very active spring across all of the lower 48. And boy, we've had a lot of active weather across the country here over the last 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think will carry forward into March, April, and May. The other thing is that there are two episodes this year that have coincided, events in the stratosphere, which I think have played a part of what has happened with the two major Arctic outbreaks this nation has seen this year, and that's called a stratospheric warming event, when the high part of the atmosphere in the 50,000 to 100,000 foot level goes through these warming cycles in the high latitudes, basically over the high latitudes near the North Pole and the Arctic Circle region. We've had two of these this year, and it looks like we're going to have one more as we get into the early part of spring. And we also have a lot of cold air still. Even though we're seeing the Arctic easing a little bit, there's a pocket of very cold air we're going to keep an eye on in the Hudson Bay, Greenland area that I think will play a role. So you put those two things together, that means for North America, a very active spring. Normally, you expect the weather to get busy during spring. But if we were to compare spring of 24 to what we're expecting in spring of 25, I think it's going to be a much different pattern.
As you look across the country, though, let's go from kind of west to east. just maybe briefly what that's going to do across some of these regions that we often talk about.
Sure. Let's start in the southwestern United States, which has been really dry. I mean, they had a good start to the season in the fall, but really since the second half of November up to present, Arizona, New Mexico, a good part of the southern half of the Great Basin states, and that would include southern Utah, southern Colorado. That has been a very dry pattern this winter, and you'd expect that during the La Nina. You also expect California to be drier than average. And despite recent rains that have come into California, it's been drier. The thing that'll happen in the southwestern United States, in those areas that are dry, my advice is be patient as we get into the dying phase of this La Nina a little bit further on into, let's say, as spring gets more mature, as we get into the second half of March, into April and May. I do see precipitation coming back into those areas.
Okay.
So that's good news. The Pacific Northwest, if we were to go north now, the Pacific Northwest, a good part of it, especially Oregon and Idaho, not so much Washington State, but Oregon and Idaho and parts of northwestern Montana and southwest Canada have been very wet. Those areas, as we go deeper into spring, into the early start of summer, I think we'll start to see a drier trend. Don't necessarily thinking that that's going to be a drought signal, so to speak, but the anomaly of being wetter is going to probably go closer to average. And then as you get into the central United States, the central and northern Rockies and the central northern plains, we'll kind of put those together. We have seen a lot of winter weather, a lot of snow along the northern half of those areas, Montana, northern parts of northern Wyoming, into North Dakota there, into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of Manitoba. Pretty deep snow cover. That is going to have a bit of an impact as it starts to melt off into early spring. That area, I think, is going to probably trend towards average spring precipitation and conditions, but it's going to work its way further south. Usually when we see the phase change from La Nina to a neutral status, the jet stream will start to track a little more south, a little more south, and a little more south before it goes back north again. So for the Central Plains and the Central Rockies, especially if you were to look at the drought monitor, we have this bullseye of very dry conditions over a large part of South Dakota, Nebraska, a good part of Wyoming, into part of the Northwest Corn Belt. That area is real susceptible to La Nina to be dry, and that's exactly what's happened. But with La Nina weakening, those areas will start to see increased storminess and increased opportunities for precipitation this spring. Now, it's been very wet into parts of the southern plains, and so as you get into the southern plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, then across the southeastern United States, they may somewhat trend this spring, maybe not as wet, but at the same time, I see the pattern there staying pretty active and busy. And then the pattern across the rest of the United States is likely going to be at or above average with precipitation, whether it's the Appalachia to up into the northeastern part of the United States and into the Great Lakes. The one area that I'm a little bit nebulous on is for the Eastern Corn Belt. That's an area where we've had a lot of storminess in the Northwest Corn Belt. We've had all of this flooding in Kentucky and Tennessee into West Virginia and to those areas, but we've kind of seen an area where it hasn't been as wet this winter and early spring season. It's been plenty cold, but that's an area that is kind of what I see as being in between systems, so to speak, and that's an area that we kind of need to watch. Right now, soil moisture conditions in the Eastern Corn Belt are good. They're not bad. But that's one area I think to watch that might be a little bit drier.
Okay, so one of the things as we look, and we've talked about this here before, just really quickly, let's kind of move through summer and into fall, what you're seeing just generally across the country.
Okay, so one assumption we've got to make for the summer forecast is that the spring forecast will be correct, because a lot of how the summer goes is how spring goes. And that's one thing I've really learned in doing long-range forecasting is to understand summer, you got to really have a good grasp on what happens during the spring season. So if the spring season evolves as we think it should, which means that there will be better chances of precipitation across the country in most areas, And that's going to lead to either improving soil moisture conditions in the drought areas and maintaining good soil moisture or above soil moisture in the areas that have been wet. When you go into the early part of summer, I can't tell you how important soil moisture is in terms of how summer gets started and how it will go. So if you have a spring that is wetter and a little bit colder, that is going to affect the front side of summer, which means front side of summer, you don't warm up too quick. You kind of have your gradual warm up in the summer, and you have that June period that still can produce storms and fronts where you can have widespread precipitation before we kind of get into the summer thunderstorm season. So if the spring goes as we suspect it will, this summer's temperature regime across the U.S. should be closer to average. In the areas that are going to be drier, not maybe getting out of drought because of that poor soil moisture, those are the areas that are likely going to be a little bit warmer. But what I don't see for the summer is a dirt burner. I don't see prolonged heat this summer. And one reason for that is La Nina's fading and going away. And if it is a wet spring, that tends to kind of throttle back summer a little bit. But one area that I do think we need to watch is that with the weakening La Nina and the jet stream pushing a little bit further south, the areas that have been colder and wetter is an area I'd watch that might be a little bit drier. And that would be the northern plains, North Dakota, northern Montana, going across the northern tier of the U.S. That's an area that we need to kind of keep an eye on. But for most of the country, I think average is going to be how summer is going to pan out.
Okay, well, average is good. We can work with average. So, okay, before we go, one more thing. We talked about this before we went on air. Let's just kind of talk briefly about 30-year drought, because we're all most everybody and from the weather side of meteorology is in agreement that we started kind of a dry spell back in 1998. Well, if we put 30 years out from that, that puts it at 2028. Now we're 25 now. So where's your thoughts around that?
I'm glad you brought that up because this is something that needs to be talked about more. And while not all of the United States is impacted the same by the Pacific Ocean, a lot of it is. And so generally speaking, the Pacific is the main driver of a lot of the weather that we have in the United States. These cycles are known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is, these are cycles that, we really haven't known about this. We've really only been starting to realize that these cycles are in place in the Pacific for the last 20 years or so. So we're kind of in the beginning stages of trying to understand the dynamics with it. But we have identified 3 of these cycles pretty well. And the first cycle we can look at is from 1947 to 1977, which was a cold phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. What do I mean by that? Does that mean there's no El Niños? No. You still have La Niñas and El Niños during this, but the overall state of the Pacific, especially the northern and central parts of the Pacific, is colder. Basically, it's the whole Pacific just decides, I want to be more cold than warm during a 30-year period. And during that, drought frequency goes up across the United States. You tend to be colder, and you also tend to have more extremes during these colder phases of the Pacific. Now, what happened from 1977 roughly to 1998 was a 21-year roughly period of the warmer Pacific Decadal Oscillation. You tend to have less drought. These are the years that people remember as the big snowstorm years. I have a lot of people say, oh man, the 70s were cold and stormy. And I remember I was out of school more often and it was just colder, and it was. In fact, even the last 100 years, some of the coldest weather was during the mid to late 70s and early 80s. Well, that was during a warm phase of the Pacific. And that abruptly came to an end in 1998 when we had what is known as the Super El Nino of 98. It was like the 21-year cycle of being warm ended with like a bang. It ended with a really warm Pacific in 98, and then we flipped. And we went to a cold Pacific Decadal Oscillation that started in 90, 99, 2000, and it's where we are today. If you look at the drought frequency from 99 to present, it's way up. We've had some severe droughts about every 10 years roughly or so, and some strong ones in between. And overall, it's been warmer and drier for a lot of you. But what's been definitely standing out is in the last 30 years, we've had 3 significant droughts across the U.S. If you look at the frequency of drought in that warmer period, they were much less. So this cycle we're in with the Pacific is more analogous to the 47-77 period as opposed to the 77-98 period. Now, you use 30 years. Well, when we go back and we look at where we think these cycles have occurred before, they come in between 20 and 30. Why is it some years 20? Why are some cycles 30? I don't know. Nobody knows. And so will we end this current cycle right at 30 years and 28? Hard to say. It could go longer than that. Do we understand all of the dynamics that take place to make these large-scale 20, 30-year patterns happen? Why do they happen? Why do they last some periods longer than others? We really don't know. And if anybody tells you they know, I would not buy a used car from them. So will this negative phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation end in 28 or around that time frame? If history is a guide, then the answer is, well, it should. When will we know that happens? We'll know it when it happens obviously we see sea surface temperature changes, but we see the frequency of La Niñas become much less apparent. And I think if people understood these, the weather that they have been living through and maybe what their dad and grandpa lived through starts to make more sense.
It does. And that explanation was really good because I don't remember going through some of that kind of information with you. So that's extremely helpful. And I think it helps as we look ahead. Very good information, Don. Appreciate you joining us here today on the program to give us that outlook.
Glad to be here.
Meteorologist Don Day giving us that long-term look at our weather here today in our 2025 outlook. Some very interesting information that he shared with us. And by the way, if you want to follow along with him each and every morning through his daily video podcast, you can find it at dayweather.com. Stick around. The Captain Tim O'Byrne is back in with this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents after this.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. A little bit chilly last couple of weeks. And I don't think Old Man Winter's quite done with us yet. Folks call me skeptical, but I did punch cows in Western Canada for quite a few years, and I've seen snow in every single month conceivable. So that's how I feel about winter. Now, Justin, you did an absolutely amazing job these past 3 episodes in your segmented 3-part interview with Alan Savory. I have to tell you, I learned more about, you nail it every single time, but to get him to open up like that to you, boy, I'll tell you what, that's a testament to your journalistic integrity, because he gave you a heck of an interview. Folks, if you missed it, go back and check it out on our podcast. Just go to the Working Ranch website. You can click on it there. And the third thing I want to mention in my 2 cents this episode is, folks, I got to tell you what, if you want like an actual glimpse into a complete scientific miracle, go on YouTube and catch a video on how a chicken egg is made. I accidentally bumped into that video. I was bored, maybe catching a flight from somewhere, and I caught this video on how a chicken makes an egg. And I'll tell you what, if that's not a miracle, there ain't nothing out there that is. Back to you in the studio, Justin.
Hey, the latest issue of Working Ranch magazine is out and, as always, packed full of a lot of great stories, articles, features, pictures, and a good listing of bull sales all across the country. But as we were down at the Cattle Industry Convention, one thing that I heard over and over by people stopping by the booth is Working Ranch magazine is the one magazine that we subscribe to, the only one they subscribe to. So don't take my word for it. Take those producers' words for it. If you want to get subscribed, you can go to workingranchmag.com. Well, if you'd like to email me, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Justin Mills. And until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.